I think AI can certainly make our lives better. And nothing, I think, makes our life better than the idea of being able to learn and satisfy your curiosity. We are really curious animals who want to understand how the world works. And anything that helps us do that, I think, makes our lives better. I, for example, use AI to learn new things, and those new things give me a great amount of joy. I've learned coding. I used to do coding when I was a kid. I now do coding again. I learn about different things I'm interested in music. I use it to actually introduce me to musical composers. So I say, I don't know anything about Brahms. What are 4 pieces that are representative of Brahms, and what should I listen for in them? And I get this fantastic instruction for how to listen to music that really helps me.
Hi, I'm Claudia Giraldo, and this season I'm here with
Ana Lucia Lenis.
This is Good Life with Good AI, the podcast where we show you how to make AI do the heavy lifting so you can get your time back
and enjoy what truly matters.
Hi, Nicklas. Hi, Ana Lu. How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
It's very good to see you, Claudia, Nicklas. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. We were dreaming with this conversation and learning about artificial intelligence and much more about your very interesting life, Nicklas.
Oh,
so
dear.
Very welcome.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. It's great to be here.
I had the pleasure to work a few projects in the past with Nicklas, but for all of you who are listening to us today, Nicklas has an amazing trajectory and a career as first philosopher. Also, he's a media and ICT lawyer in Sweden, a PhD on applied information technology and informatics from the University of Gothenburg. And as part of his amazing career, he joined Google in 2007, if I'm not wrong, Nicklas.
That's right.
Then joined the Google DeepMind policy team, has been professor in the Royal Institute of Technology, adjunct professor. And now also, Nicklas, you just started some time ago as a co-founder of Faros Futures Research Group. You are an author, angel investor, researcher, and philosophy of technology. So I don't know when you did all of this, because it's a very amazing curriculum. But in addition to that, you have been so kind to be with us and spend your time, and we know that you are very busy. So thank you again for joining us. It's very difficult to just do a short overview about your career, but I'm sure that we're going to have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about you during this conversation.
Thank you for that introduction. It's very kind and very generous. I feel like I've done a lot of things, but maybe I just couldn't decide what to actually do. Maybe it's just indecision. But it's very kind of you, and I'm very happy to be here.
Well, it is very impressive, and it's a privilege for us to have you here. It's not often that we have a philosopher with us. And so it's intriguing. What was it that drove you to technology, and what made you actually pursue your career in that field?
Well, I think it has to do with growing up in the age of personal computers to some degree. So when I was 12 years old, I got my first computer. We had Swedish computers back then called an ABC-80. And so I started programming around the age of 12. I loved computers. They were magical machines. After a while, I also got video game, the Atari 2600, and you sort of get sucked into this technology life. And I was a total nerd when I was a kid. I collected Star Wars figurines. I loved technology. I read science fiction. Everything I could get my hands on, I would devour. So I guess it started there. But your question sort of has another bottom too, which is this question of why would the philosopher be interested in technology? I think there are 2 really interesting answers to that question. One of them is that technology tells us a lot about ourselves. Because the kinds of technologies we develop, the kinds of technologies we use are in many ways mirrors in which we can see ourselves, and we can start to understand ourselves in a different way. A culture that develops a hammer is one culture. A culture that develops a weapon is another culture. And you can sort of, through technology, you can understand human beings, which is what the entire project of philosophy is all about, I think. And philosophy is also about something else, something that sort of touches all of us. It's about questions of power. And as Hans Jonas liked to say, all use of technology is the exercise of power. So understanding technology is actually understanding the way we live together. So to some degree, it's a profoundly philosophical question to start with. And I would almost claim that philosophy could claim technology as its own question rather than sort of feeling as a guest in the space of technology, because it's so profoundly about the human condition.
How interesting. And
Yeah.
going into that sci-fi element, I think that ties up really nicely with your focus on AI.
Yes.
So why AI? Because right now everybody's looking at AI, right? It's a boom. But you started way back when this was not popular. So
Yes,
what made you look that way?
Well, I was fascinated by it. I had read Isaac Asimov's early novels, I, Robot, etc., and I was just, I think, 12 or 13 years old. And so when I came to university and studied philosophy, there was this specific course in this philosophy of mind. And this was back in 1995-ish. And so I wanted to understand how to think about artificial minds. And this course had a lot of texts that were about artificial intelligence, texts from people like Daniel Dennett, who was a famous philosopher, or Marvin Minsky and others. So I thought it was just beautiful to have the opportunity to dig deep into the philosophy of AI and do that then. But if you had told me back then that this was going to be a big deal, we would all have laughed because it was just us nerds being super interested in this. I remember we specifically coded a small artificial bot that fell off a table, and we tried to understand if it could understand what the table was and if it could understand why it fell off the table, and if that meant that it possibly had a mind or not. It was like really nerdy questions. But we worked a lot on that, and I always found it really interesting to think about sort of the intersection between technology and philosophy. So this was back in 96, 97. And then I just kept at it because I really liked the idea, the vision of artificial intelligence. I think I liked it for several different reasons. One reason I liked it was that it felt as if it gave us hope that we could have something very intelligent partner up with to help us solve our problems. And that's something I still feel. I mean, there's reason to hope that artificial intelligence will allow us to solve some really hard problems. But I also like this idea of interacting with something that was just very different from us, but still intelligent. So I kept at it. I wrote a couple of essays. I actually wrote a small book about it. And I remember specifically, and I think I've mentioned this story to you before, that I really wanted to follow up on the whole idea of artificial intelligence. And back in, I think it was 2006, I was the managing editor of a magazine, and I was traveling all over the US. As one of the things I wanted to do was to interview John McCarthy, who is one of the founders that went to the original summer school in Dartmouth and probably has the best claim on being the person who came up with the term artificial intelligence. And in 2006, it was exactly 50 years after the summer Dartmouth school. So I wanted to interview him, and I had a very clear idea about what I wanted to write. The essay I wanted to write, I even had the title for it. It was called The Disappointment of Professor McCarthy, because I thought that
powerful.
That's very strong.
I assumed that he would be disappointed, right? Because this was 50 years after he had coined the term, and we had been through 2 or 3 AI winters, and it didn't seem to be moving a lot. The idea of artificial intelligence seemed to have stalled. And so I had this really clear idea that I will talk to him and I would explore why he felt that it hadn't succeeded, why the project had essentially failed. And so I called him up, and he was super generous. He said, you can come out to my house. He was at that point retired from teaching at Stanford. So he was a professor emeritus. And so he lived on the outskirts of the Stanford campus. And I traveled out there. I knocked on his door, and he opened, and he was like yay high and looked like a really angry owl. So he would let me in. He said, I have an hour, and then I need to get back to writing my short story about science fiction and neutrino beams. So he gave me an hour, and I remember I thought it's better now to just launch into the conversation. So I launched into it, and I said, well, Professor McCarthy, aren't you horribly disappointed in the way the artificial intelligence field has developed? And he just took a step back, and he looked at me, and he said, young man, that was the most stupid question I've ever had. And you can imagine me then, a young writer thinking that I had this great thing to write an excellent essay, right? And he just shot it down. And then he continued. Yeah. And that's when it gets interesting, because then he continued and he said, look, for any sufficiently advanced technology, any like real technological breakthrough, nothing happens in the first 50 years because we need 50 years, a generation and a half, to understand the technology. And then once we understand it, we can start to use and develop it and really, really build it. And so in the second half of those 100 years, that's where all of the evolution comes. It describes essentially an exponential curve of development. And he went through area after area where he felt that this was true, like genetics, where Mendel discovered inheritance, but very little happened. And then in the last 50 years, we sequenced the genome. And all of these fields he went through with me and said, so in the next 50 years, I promise you, artificial intelligence is going to explode. And there was no doubt in his mind that this technology would come to fruition. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2012, or otherwise I would just have called him up and say, well, you're right, I was wrong. So my essay I had to change, luckily, and I could write about I think I changed the title to Idealist Who Still Believes in the Future. And he was right. So there was a really interesting set of lessons for me there. But also looking back at it now, I'm amazed at how he could have such strong faith in the technology and also be right. But then again, he was smarter than I am. So there you go.
You see, Claudia, it's very interesting because first, many people in our conversations, when we start talking about AI, we're thinking about something that was developed a few years ago. And for some people, very short time. And now Nicklas is talking about AI since 1990 something. That's a little bit like, wow, okay. And then some people working in technology said, but you have been using AI when you use Waze to find a place or when you want to use a translator. And AI is not so new, but it is amazing to see the development, how the process has been very fast in terms of adoption and understanding this technology. So it's very, very impressive. And why do you think, Nicklas, that now we have this boom on AI and everybody, is talking about this?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that happened because even though John McCarthy had very strong faith in the project, the version of the project that he had faith in was something that we refer to today as GoFi, good old-fashioned AI. The idea behind GoFi was that human thinking could be described essentially as a logical system and a logical calculus. So if we could just capture the logic behind human thinking, we would be able to replicate it and build intelligent and learning machines. Now, turns out that that's not exactly how things work. We are not very logical beings. And the reason is that evolution is not very logical. Evolution has another fundamental underlying architecture, and that is that it's probabilistic. It works on probabilities, not on logical truths. And so what happened was that McCarthy and Minsky and a lot of the other pioneers, they insisted that the only program that was the right research program was the logic program. And they actually also suppressed a lot of other research that went in other directions. But a few people were really determined to keep exploring other paths than the logical one. Amongst them were people like Jeff Hinton, Joshua Bengio, Jan LeCun, and Fei-Fei Li as well. What they were all exploring was this idea that maybe if we look at probabilistic prediction of different things, we'll come closer to intelligence. And with the advent of much more powerful computers and much larger data sets, they could test their hypotheses. And it turned out that they were right. The probabilistic model beat the logical model, at least in the first instance, by far. And that's the point at which we started to get systems that really started to look and feel intelligent. And I think the reason the boom came was actually that no technology develops in isolation. Always develops in an entire network of possibilities. And what happened was that the network of possibilities unlocked new ideas to think about artificial intelligence, massive data sets, massive compute, new kinds of algorithms. Together, these sort of unlocked the idea of artificial intelligence. And when we hear somebody like Demis Hassabis, for example, the founder of DeepMind, talk about this, he very consciously went away and studied computer science and then neuroscience when he wanted to do artificial intelligence because he realized at the time that he was going into school that it was too early. So he saw this entire network and essentially said, well, we still need a few unlocks in this network to get to where we need to be. And so in the meantime, I'll spend time getting as much knowledge as I possibly can in order to be able to build this thing. And so he sort of had the vision to see that that was happening. So the answer to your question, I think, on why now is because the network is unlocking constantly new sort of capabilities for us to draw on when we build artificial intelligence. And that's when you get the great big breakthrough in, I think, November 2022 of ChatGPT. So
yeah, it's really interesting to hear you speak, because the way that you describe how artificial intelligence works, how it was conceived, sort of takes the mystery out of intelligence, right? Intelligence more like predictions, being able to look at probabilities, as you will say. And it's also very interesting the way it has evolved. Most people tend to focus a lot on the risks and have this really pessimistic outlook of, the world is going to end. What are we going to do? But it brings an infinite number of possibilities. And one of the things that you mentioned in the past that I really liked was when you said, actually, this is the best time ever to be curious and to learn. And so I would love for you to expand a little bit on that, if that's okay.
Of course. No, I think one of the things that we tend to over-index on when we talk about artificial intelligence is the noun intelligence. So intelligence sounds really good. It sounds as if it's something concrete. And so we like to talk about artificial intelligence. But nouns are deceiving because in many ways, what they give us is this sense of something real, but we don't quite know what it is. You can hear it when you hear a corporate executive say, I'm going to implement artificial intelligence. And it sounds as if he is buying furniture and is going to place it in the factory. Something like that. It's like really weird.
Exactly.
But what's more interesting is if you scratch the surface of the noun, you often find a verb. And the verb that underlies intelligence is learning, I think. I think that's the most, there are several others too, learning, discovery, those kinds of things, curiosity. But learning is so fundamental to the entire project. In fact, if you go back to the first texts that were produced in the Dartmouth Summer School, they all spoke about the ability to build a machine that could learn. If you go back to Herbert Simon, who in 1969 wrote about the information explosion, and in that paper, in 1969, mind you, wrote that the only chance for us to deal with the massive amount of information that we now have is to build artificial intelligence. He said that the goal of artificial intelligence would be for a school kid to learn a difficult subject an order of magnitude faster. So learning was always there in the beginning, but then we started to focus on intelligence instead because we're a bit starstruck by the noun intelligence. Now, the reality is that what we have built are machines that are fantastically good at learning, but also learning with us. So if you think about simple tools like NotebookLM, where you can put in all the stuff you want to learn, you can get it in a podcast, you can get it in a PowerPoint, all of those different things. Those are exceptional tools for learning. And we see this in the research too. The outcomes for students that work with these tools are much better than those who are without them. And so to some degree, there's very little you can't learn if you set your mind to it today. And that's unique. Because in most of human history, learning has been scarce. You've been lucky if you went to school because schools were the only place you can learn because there was just a few teachers. So the ability to learn has been rationed. It's been sort of scarce. It's been hard to come by. What we're seeing now is that we're actually moving towards a society where there's an abundance of learning opportunity. Now, the question, of course, then is up to us. What do we want to learn? And how are we going to apply ourselves to make sure we do?
When you say learn, people usually associate learning with early childhood or with school, right? But learning is actually something much greater than that, and it applies to all of us. As you know, we have people of all sorts of professions here, walks of life. And so if you could give them just a few practical ideas on things that they could do to learn whatever they're interested in.
Well, I think there are plenty of things. I'll give you two very practical things. We talked about NotebookLM already, and I think using NotebookLM, putting in the documents you want to learn and then listen to the podcast that comes out or doing the quiz, that's sort of one thing. But another thing that you can do that I think is really interesting is to go to your favorite chatbot and then you schedule an update every day. You say, I have 5 minutes, 15 minutes, I have an hour every day, and I would like to learn more more about, say, the Roman Empire. So give me something really interesting and ask me 2 questions about it every single day. And the bot will dutifully give you something every day, and it will sort of come up again and again. And you can go back to it whenever you want to. It's a super simple way of actually learning about the subject in the kinds of chunks that are possible for you to deal with in your day-to-day. So that's a very simple way of doing it. Another simple way of doing it is actually to go to something called the system prompt in your bot. So the system prompt in your bot is a general instruction for how you want it to behave. All of the chatbots have these. And one of the things I recommend people to do is, if they want to learn more about AI, I say to the bot that every time you ask a question, it should point out something that it doesn't think you know that you can do with a bot. Because what happens is that every time you ask, every time you work with a bot, it tells you something it thinks you didn't know. And so you learn by just using it. You sort of get wrapped into the tool.
It's very interesting, Nicklas, because in many cases, and now that I have the pleasure of co-hosting this podcast with Claudia, I have many people that just write into me like, Analu, give me tools. Let me know what I can learn about AI. And I think the expectation of many people is, okay, you can take this training, or you can go to this school, or you can, and in this case, you're giving us very clear example on how we can use the tools, including the free tools, to just ask with curiosity and a little bit of more, interest. You can ask a tool to teach you, and you don't need to pay for anything. That obviously there's many ways, but it's very interesting to see these interesting ways of learning.
You're quite right. And I distinctly remember a friend of mine who I was trying to teach to use AI, who had not used a lot of it, called me up at some point and said, you said there was something I could do with a prompt in order to get it to do this thing. What was it? And I just said quietly, ask it. And, asked it.
That's great advice.
And then I could hear him in the phone go like, oh, yeah, okay. Oh. And suddenly it's like, okay, so that's interesting. I call this dude who I know, but I actually have this machine that is infinitely more knowledgeable about both itself and AI and all of those different things. So why didn't I ask the machine? And I think it's really, really true. There's a version of this that is more of an anecdote, but it's kind of funny. It's like, so one of the interview questions that we thought we would have at Google, but we never used, it was a science fiction interview question. We tested it on a few people, a bit of a silly question, but it was fun. And it was fun for the same reason. And the reason was this: you would go to somebody and you would say to them, okay, assume, for the sake of argument, that we, the company, have built an artificial intelligence that's 10,000 times more intelligent than a human being. Should we tell people in society about it, or should we not? And, you could see people struggle with this question and think about it. Should you tell them? Shouldn't you tell them? And after a while, you would release them from their pain and say, okay, look, it's in the question. It's 10,000 times more intelligent than you. Must ask it. Ask it.
Exactly.
You don't need to know anything more than that in the question. So there are examples of this. The AI is actually self-diffusing, self-teaching in ways that is quite helpful to us.
That's so true. And at so many levels, right? I didn't know anything about podcasting before starting this or producing any type of content. And now I just use one tool to give me the prompt for the other one. And I'm producing videos and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
And we're coding and we're doing all these other things too. And after a while, you realize that you can even ask the machine to tell you how to code. And so we've grown up with this idea that there are certain skills that are not attainable for us because you have to go through different paths in life to acquire those skills. But that's no longer true. So, for example, if you want to build a tool that helps you take care of your aquarium or helps you to plan your next trip or something like that, ask the machine and it will walk you through how to do it. And one of the things I also tell people is that you do not have to be ashamed in front of the machine. I often tell the AI when I'm working with it, okay, consider me as smart as the average 12-year-old and help me with this. And the machine happily does. It's like, okay, here you go. Here's what you need to do. And it's great. I think that to some degree, this removes the prestige from the learning situation. It's really hard to ask another person to say, explain it to me as if I was 12 years old. But because you sort of don't want to admit that you don't get it.
Yeah.
The machine doesn't care. So the prestige-less learning opportunity is actually also really good for kids because they can ask and ask and ask and ask. They don't have to feel ashamed when they're asking the 12th time. And I think that's actually quite nice.
That's true. You can ask as many times as you want, and the machine will still like you. Well, a little bit.
At least it won't tell you that you're stupid. It won't say, well, stop, I've explained this to you. It's like,
oh, the 10 times and you're not understanding this.
Yeah.
What happened?
Infinitely more patient.
So it grows irritated with you if you want, I suppose.
And Nicklas, maybe going back a little bit with what Claudia mentioned, that we were discussing that there's many people, and we had conversations in the past with other guests in this podcast, that there's a lot of anxiety for some people about using AI. And what do you tell people feeling this about AI and what the future brings for them?
Well, I tell them not to be afraid of the technology because the technology is not particularly scary. It's not particularly dangerous in many ways. There are scenarios for the future where we have control problems and safety problems, and all of that is real, and we have to take care of that. But in your personal situation, always use the technology in order to understand things better. And there are different kinds of anxieties, I think. At least I encounter different kinds of anxiety. One of the most common ones is, will this take my job? And the answer to that question is no, it won't. Because for a very large set of cases, it will help you do your job. And it will furthermore help you develop your job in ways that will be really interesting. But you have to acquire a slightly different skill in order for that to happen. There's a fancy term for this called metacognition. Metacognition is essentially being able to think about thinking. So if you're able to think about thinking or think about your job and see it for what it is, here are the steps, here are the things I do, here are the things I produce, the things I can do better. If you can start to sort of think about your work that way, then the AI can help you enormously. And it can remove the boring bits, it can add new exciting bits, it can allow you to do your work not just more efficiently, that's sort of one axis of change, but in new ways. So innovation is the other axis of change. So if you imagine these two curves, we usually just think in terms of efficiency, and that's why we're afraid of losing jobs. But if you also think in terms of innovation, new things you can do, you realize that your entire job might move up into another space where there's a lot of new things you can do faster. So I think that's something that's really important, but it requires that you start actively reflecting about what it is you do. You need to start thinking about thinking. And that's not something that we do naturally. So it takes a bit of training. Luckily, the machines can help us do it and help us sort of frame and reframe and understand what we do. But we have to want to understand what we do. We have to want to think about thinking. And that's a tricky part, I think.
It's not easy because I remember doing questions and reframing many times. And the response of the AI tool is different. It's changing because it's also changing what I'm asking. So if you ask one time and you have a response and you think that this response is the full truth about something, maybe you are missing a lot, and maybe you can make a wrong decision or take a wrong path in your investigation. So it's very interesting how you have to train this. So it will take time, but we have to be positive that we can do it.
Yes. And the other thing that's actually quite interesting, most people forget this. So there is a common failure mode, which is thinking about AI as a sort of advanced search engine. And you put a question in, you get an answer back. You put a question in, you get an answer back, and you think it's a search engine. A much more interesting way of using it is actually to ask it to ask you questions. So, okay, I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and intellectual property. Ask me questions about it and work with me. And then as it starts to ask you questions, you can discover what you think and you can talk to it and you can have a really interesting dialogue. By just switching who actually asks the questions is actually quite a powerful trick.
Yep. And Nicklas, I couldn't resist the temptation of asking you the following. AI is a very complex subject for many people, right? And so there's these people who are super optimistic, these people who are super pessimistic, all sorts of assumptions and sci-fi scenarios. Parts of them true and real and things we should be thinking and concerned about, but others just out of the wildest imagination. And so you've been following the development of AI for such a long time now. People fear that having machines that eventually could be smarter than us kind of takes a little bit out of our humanity. Do you think AI makes us more human or less human?
I think it ultimately makes us more human because there are many things that we don't have to do that the machine does better. If you go back just to the 1940s, we had people doing mechanical calculations because there weren't any good calculators. That's not a very human piece of work. It's actually quite automated and repetitive. And when we got calculators, those people could go and do other things. They could go think about what the calculations meant. They could go invent new kinds of calculations. All of those different things were possible. So to some degree, I think that AI actually allows us to be really curious about the world around us by freeing us up from some work that is mechanic and should be automated. Now, there's a way to sort of address this question, which is to say, technology does not make you anything. You make you something. So you decide if you want to be more human with the technology or less human with the technology. Let me give you an example. Somebody asks you to write an essay. You now have the choice to go to the AI and say, here's the essay theme, write it for me. And the essay will be written by the AI and it will be quite good for sure. And you will then have done what is called cognitive offloading. You will essentially be less human. Now, the other thing you can do is to essentially have a conversation with the AI and say, ask me questions about this subject because I'm writing an essay about it and I want to figure out what I think. The AI asks you a lot of questions about the subject and you have a conversation back and forth. And suddenly you realize what you think, you discover what it is you want to write. And then you do this. You go somewhere, you take paper and a pen, you write longhand your essay. And as you write your essay longhand, you really discover what you think because writing is thinking. Now you have a set of papers written in longhand on the basis of a conversation where the AI teased out of you what you think. And the good thing about all of this is that the AI now comes to your assistance again. Now you just take pictures of your longhand and it transcribes it into text that you can then share and send in. Now, did the technology make us more or less human? In the first case, you choose to be less human by offloading all of the cognition and work on the machine. In the second case, you became much more human because you engaged in a discussion, you wrote longhand, you really spent time thinking, and you deepened your humanity. So the choice is ours. Now, there's a trap here, though. And the choice is not going to be easy. And the trap is actually something that was placed in us by evolution. Evolution is great, but it doesn't optimize. It does good enough. But evolution is happy if it gets something that doesn't fall apart immediately because, then it will work until the next generation. Evolution has put a lot of traps in us. So one of the traps is the well-known sugar and fat trap. When we were all on the steppes somewhere hunting food, we almost never saw sugar and fat anywhere. But when we saw sugar and fat, we were like, okay, better eat this because you never know when you're going to see it again. So you just ate it. You ate all of the sugar and fat you could possibly see.
Yeah.
Fast forward to today, what happens is that there's sugar and fat at every corner store. And the evolutionary trap within us springs itself, and suddenly we eat all of this stuff and we get obesity problems, we get a lot of different health problems, etc. from it. So that's an evolutionary trap. There is, unfortunately, a similar evolutionary trap when it comes to thinking. Because thinking is one of the most metabolically expensive things you can do. Your brain consumes 20% of your body's energy. 20% of your body's energy is consumed by your brain. So thinking is something that we'd rather not do. Evolution put brains in our heads because they were really useful, but it didn't want us to use them all the time. It didn't want us to use them too much because it consumed too much energy. So suddenly we encounter this machine that says, hey, I can think for you. And we go like, oh, that's good. But thinking is something that evolution told me I shouldn't do that often because it consumes a lot of energy. And so we had it. So we get sort of a mental obesity problem where we get thoughtlessness just in the same way we get obesity because there's an evolutionary trap within us that triggers. But we can fix this. Just as we can choose to have a diet, we can choose to train, we can choose to sort of go to a fitness center, we can choose to learn, we can choose to write, we can choose to engage intellectually with things. But it's not going to be easy. Just as everyone knows that it's easy to go to the gym on January 1st, but you're not coming in on March the 3rd. So you just have to start thinking about that in the same way.
And guilty.
Me
Everyone is, I think.
Just guilty. But I was thinking, I used to like, especially when I was in school, writing essays and all of that. And for me, the most difficult part, maybe I had my ideas, but it was how to organize. Because sometimes you have a bunch of ideas coming up, but you don't know exactly how to organize. And to have a tool that can help me and say, put your ideas and I can help you to organize. Also, you don't pass the homework to the machine, but the machine is helping you. So that's a nice way to do something amazing and that we didn't have when we were in high school or earlier. So that's super interesting. And maybe talking about writing, you recently wrote a book, Nicklas, that is called The Future Habit. That is here.
Oh,
Good.
right. Yeah.
That's better. I was ready, but wrong. My dyslexia. But we thought it was very interesting to ask you a little bit about this because in this book, you talk about how we are very concerned about the future and how difficult it is to understand what is going to happen because everything is changing so fast. And a lot of people have a small business. They are running companies in many different areas and they have the same thinking, how I can prepare for the future. But you're explaining with a lot of methodology how we can use AI in our advantage. So that will be amazing if you can elaborate a little bit more and tell us about this, because I'm sure that many people listening to us, they will be curious and try to understand how they can use AI to take this future and the lack of certainty as an advantage.
Yes. So when David and I wrote the book, the idea was that we wanted to give people a sense of how they could create choice in complexity. So there's so much happening, there's so much uncertainty that sometimes we feel we don't know what to do. And that is a feeling of not having choice. And so we wanted to write a really accessible book for anyone who was interested in thinking about the future in a structured way. Because the way you create choice is by having these methods, these tools, these methodologies that you describe, because they in turn will allow you to structure the uncertainty in different ways. So the book is full with classical foresight technologies or tools or methods like scenario planning, backcasting predictions, all of the tools that we have traditionally used to think about the future. And those tools used to be quite complex. You had to set up a scenario planning workshop. You had to sort of learn how to do predictions in really difficult ways, etc. But now the machine can help us actually apply these tools in ways that make them much, much more accessible. And that's why we wrote the book. We wanted to show how to make foresight tools more accessible to people. So the book contains a lot of examples of how you can do a very simple scenario planning exercise for your business, for example. Just figure out, okay, what are the different scenarios that I should be preparing for? And then you can look at the kind of choices that those scenarios give you. Or if you're setting out to do a project, which are the ways in which this project could fail? A simple prompt can help you actually look at your project and find weaknesses in it. So the idea here was to show people that tools that used to be expensive and exclusive and tools that used to be only sort of available for a very select few are now available for anyone who has access to a chatbot. So this is sort of the gist of the book, what we really wanted to show. And then we have a lot of examples in there. We have a lot of different things, but it's meant to be super simple. It's meant to really show you that you don't need to be a programmer or a coder or any of those things. You just need to have the tool and the bot, and together you can use them in order to grasp the future in a slightly more authoritative way and get a sense of what your choices are.
I like this concept of using AI to your advantage. As it's readily available. And if we go from the company side to the individual, the premise of this podcast is actually to use AI obviously in a responsible way, in a smart way, to make your life better. Do you think AI can make our lives better and bring us more balance?
I really do. And I think it actually has to do with how we use them. So I, for example, use AI to learn new things, and those new things give me a great amount of joy. I've learned coding. I used to do coding when I was a kid. I now do coding again. I learn about different things I'm interested in music. I use it to actually introduce me to musical composers. So I say, I don't know anything about Brahms. What are 4 pieces that are representative of Brahms, and what should I listen for in them? And I get this fantastic instruction for how to listen to music that really helps me. So I think AI can certainly make our lives better. And nothing, I think, makes our life better than this sort of idea of being able to learn and satisfy your curiosity. We are really curious animals who want to understand how the world works. And anything that helps us do that, I think, makes our lives better. Curiosity is an innate need in not children, but us as well. And so I think that's where AI really plays a decisive role. And I think that's on the individual level. There's also an answer here on the collective, social, societal level, because that curiosity, when we organize it and we start to structure it in different ways, is called science. And so one of the things where I think AI can make the biggest difference in the future is in scientific discovery. I worked with Google DeepMind when DeepMind got the Nobel Prize for AlphaFold, which was a protein folding service that could allow us to discover different kinds of new drugs and cure diseases, all those different things. And one of the things that really struck me was the enormous amount of work that went into thinking about scientific discovery. And the hope is that if we use AI in the right way, it will actually turn out not to be a chatbot. If you write the history of AI in, say, 30 years, we shouldn't be writing the history of chatbots. We should be writing the history of a new kind of scientific instrument. So just like a telescope allows you to see stuff that's really far away, or a microscope allows you to see really small things, AI allows you to see really complex things in simpler ways. And so to some degree, we're building this fantastic scientific instrument that allows us to accelerate scientific discovery. And that's the history I hope that we will be writing in 30 years about AI. And maybe we'll be even able to say things like, in the years between 2027 and 2037, we had more scientific discoveries than in the preceding 100 years. That would be fantastic and not outside of the realm of possibility. So if you sort of go to the question of can AI make your life better, it absolutely can on an individual level. If you think about it on a sort of social collective level, I also think it can. I think we have some real good shots at curing diseases, at least making a dent in problems like climate change, understanding pandemics better, and generally just taking care of the kinds of complex problems that we're facing as a civilization right now, where I actually don't think that our own efforts alone will be enough. So you talked about risk before, the risk of using AI. I think the risk of not using AI is actually significant because the kinds of problem we face right now require more thinking. And that thinking needs to be more complex in some cases than the kind of thinking that we can do as human beings. So AI might actually be a key to unlocking the solutions to those challenges.
And you're also pointing something interesting about science, because when we talk about science in general, we're thinking about people in a lab, creating the cure or the new medicine for this disease. But it looks like AI will help us, normal people in our houses, to be or feel close to science, that what it used to be, There are some uses or examples of how we can feel that AI will put us a little bit more close to science, like applications or examples that maybe you have?
So such a good point. And there's a question of sort of where science happens in society. If science happens in a very small set of people who are at universities, then we have essentially failed, because science should be our organized central curiosity project as human civilization. It should be civilizational project in many ways. And there are tons of places where this now happens. Simple examples like large research projects that are publishing their data and asking people to help analyze the data together with them, and engaging this notion of the citizen scientist, again, making sure that we participate in the scientific project. I happen to think that one of the success metrics for science should be the number of people who are actively participating in science. And I think that's something that's really important. But we also now have apps and allow us to learn about science in really simple ways. There's, for example, apps like Consensus app. It's a beautiful service that allows you to look at any particular question and then see how many studies are saying that it's right or it's wrong. So take vitamin D. Does vitamin D help against COVID or not? That was a huge discussion during a pandemic. You can ask that question, and what the app does is it looks up 200 million different studies and then gives you a result saying, well, here is this many studies that say that it does, and this many studies say that it doesn't, and here is the content, and you can look at it and compare and see what the data sets are and the study design is, and you can sort of go through it yourself. There are services like elicit.com that allow you to publish essentially a research report that is university research assistant level on any subject that you can think of. And of course, what you do when you have these reports is you put them into your NotebookLM. You turn them into a podcast, you listen to them on your way to work, and suddenly you're engaged in science in a very different way again. So there are tons of different ways in which you can engage in science. I really recommend that because there's something beautiful about this notion of human curiosity organized towards trying to figure out how the world works.
And then also understanding the gaps. I was very curious to see a few days ago that I saw that thanks to AI, also researchers can see and find gaps in the investigations in science. So, for example, how many women will suffer from many diseases or the funding, the goals to this kind of diseases is very small. And this is something that everybody maybe knows, but with AI, it was much easier for journalists and investigations about these kind of problems for society. So it's not only finding the investigations in the laboratories, it's also how we can raise awareness about problems in society and on science, like these gaps.
Absolutely right. And I think the other thing we can do is to identify gaps that we didn't know existed where we might actually have a lot of clues that we could use. So the AI can look through, because there's so much science published. You can say, okay, here are a couple of studies that if you put them together, actually seem to suggest that there is something really interesting you can do about, say, for example, carbon dioxide saturation problems. So the ability to find out not just what sort of has been published, but also what the sum total of what has been published might actually mean is really interesting. Humanity is constantly in this weird situation where we don't know what we know, because there's so much we know that we haven't coordinated. So you could say that one way to salvation is actually knowing what we know. And the AI takes us one step on the path towards that.
Thank you, Nicklas. This is such a breath of fresh air. It's reminding us a little bit how we're the owners of our destiny. It all depends on what we do with things. If you look at the world with the lens that you're describing, there was probably no better time in history to be in public office, for example, because you have so much information and tools to be able to properly analyze things and have a better impact on people's lives, right? On societies. So along those lines, you've already mentioned quite a few things for people to look into, but we usually like closing our episodes, asking our guests to recommend things to people. So either things to do or books to read. Probably yours is a good place to start. But also, things that you might want to recommend to our audience.
Well, I recommend generally to read older books about artificial intelligence and to find the really old books, because they're usually quite good. And so there's a ton of books that were written in the 1980s, for example. There's a lot written by Daniel Dennett that I quite like, for example, or an author called Margaret Bowden. Both of them have written really good things about the human mind. And their interest has been the human mind first, and then also how machines can replicate different aspects of the human mind. And so I would recommend reading those older books, because they were written in a time when they didn't actually have to think about all of the commercial aspects, or they didn't have to try to be bestsellers, because they knew that there was only a select few people who were interested. Margaret Bowden is fantastic. She has written a lot about creativity in AI. What does it mean for a machine to be creative? So I would strongly recommend reading older books about artificial intelligence. In terms of tools, this may sound like it's advanced, but it's not. I would recommend anyone to use a coding agent and try to build a very simple tool of some kind that they think could help them. Because if you discover how easy that is, it unlocks an entire world for you. So say, for example, that you use Claude Code. and you ask Claude Code to build for you a weekly family planner that allows, everyone in the family to log into a server and say what they're doing. And then you have a calendar and you can sync it with your Google Calendar or Microsoft Calendar. It sounds like an advanced, super duper hard software project. In reality, it can now be done in 15 minutes. And most people don't know this.
That's impressive, yeah.
And so the reality is that if you can start to think in tools and you can start to think in different kinds of applications, you're going to be able to build off the shelf your own application universe. And it's not as hard as it sounds. I know that a lot of people listening will go like, oh, coding, that's not for me. I don't have a computer science degree. You don't need to. Claude has one. It's okay. What you need to do is to be able to describe the tool. If you can describe it, you can work with it. Google AI Studio, fantastic place to start too. Go in there, describe the app you want, see what happens, and then start using it. And you will be surprised at what you can actually build. And once you see that, you will unlock an entirely new domain of creativity. And really try it. Google AI Studio, go in, describe the app you want, and see the tool build it for you. And then you can change the app. You can add features. You can take them out. You can browse some of the existing apps if you want ideas. But this idea that you can move from being a consumer of apps to a builder of apps, and you can actually design tools that are for you and not generic, is quite a powerful one. And it unlocks a whole new way of thinking about and working with AI.
That's very impressive. Yeah? Then you can create your own set of tools special for you. That's cool.
Personalized software, that's where we're heading.
Yeah.
There's a good challenge.
Yes.
There's a good challenge.
Nicklas, thank you so much. Sometimes I wish that this podcast would last longer when we have guests like you.
Well, we have to be nice to the listeners all too. They might need to do other things. Yes. Like they need to go test Google AI Studio, for example.
That's true. That's true. We're going to give them time to do that. But hopefully we'll have you again at some point. Thank you for taking the time of speaking to us. We've really valued and enjoyed this conversation very, very much.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you, Nicklas. We have a lot of fun. And then I think we can take notes about many ideas and tools and recommendations that we can apply every day in our lives. So that's the goal, make our life easier. So
Yes.
Thank you for sharing all your knowledge with us.
Perfect. Thank you.
And to all of you, thank you for being with us for another episode of Good Life with Good AI. Today's guest thinks as well that we can make our lives better with AI. So let's play a little bit with the tools. Let's learn a little bit more. That's the whole point, right? To have a better life. Don't forget to follow us in YouTube or in Spotify so you get the alerts when new episodes come up. And we will continue this interesting path of exploring how people are thinking about AI, what they're doing with it, and ways in which we can improve our lives, hopefully with guests as wonderful as the one we had today, who has been actually very close to the development of these tools. So thank you again and see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.